And then screen sharing. Okay, last week we stopped with the first part of the passion narrative. So we will continue with the passion narratives today. And so today we will look at the narratives from right after the Garden of Gethsemane all the way to the cross. Okay, so the first major stop after Jesus was arrested was the Sanhedrin trial. Matthew only has two trials, one with the Sanhedrin, one with Pilate. You get more trials in the other Gospels. Matthew kind of goes through this very quickly. If you ever visit Jerusalem, they have 14 stations between Caiaphas's so-called house, or where the Sanhedrin met, because they did not meet at the temple or any synagogue where they're supposed to meet because it's night. And Jewish law at the time did not allow any court to operate at night. So this is the first of their own laws that they would break. The pilgrimage to Calvary or Golgotha has 14 stations. Good evening, Mary. And they are marked. And so pilgrims will actually stop at each station and do a short prayer, and then you move on. And they mark these 4 stations. So imagine you're traveling on that pilgrimage starting from Caiaphas's house. There is a beautiful little church that supposedly marks the place where this first trial was held, Caiaphas's church, named after him. And so Jesus was brought for trial before the Sanhedrin, and Matthew gives us certain pertinent information. He doesn't go into great details like Luke has more details, and even Mark has a bit more details, but he tells us who the chair of the Sanhedrin was, and that was Caiaphas. Now, here's we run into a bit of headache because the archaeological record shows that there were 2 Caiaphas's high priests at about the same time. And to this day, scholars are not fully in agreement as to which of those 2 Caiaphases was the Caiaphas of the Gospels. In Luke, we learn that he had a father-in-law who had also been a high priest called Annas, but that is not mentioned here. Archaeological excavations have unveiled 2 tombs to high priests that were called Caiaphas. And what's interesting about the archaeological record is that the 2 Caiaphases present a very different picture. One of them seemed to have been a good high priest. The other one seemed to have been a really corrupt high priest. Now, in the Gospels, the natural response is that the corrupt high priest is the one who was here. But then why would they have 2 high priests, same name, 2 different tombs? And this makes the situation a little bit less clear. We do know what the situation was. In order to become high priest, you actually have to pay money to the Roman emperor, to Caesar, to be appointed. And so he can just as quickly remove you from office as appointing you. So it's quite possible that there were 2 Caiaphases back to back, and some of the problems may have arisen because of this trial of Jesus. We may have to wait for the archaeological record to clarify which of those 2 is the real biblical one. Now, the law says that you must have, this is the Torah law, when you bring somebody and accuse them of a crime and you bring them to the Sanhedrin, there must be 2 witnesses who are in perfect agreement in their testimony, otherwise you cannot convict the person. Now, Matthew tells us that they had more than 2 witnesses, but none of them could agree with each other. And so this was the second rule they would break, that they would go ahead with the trial and even find Jesus guilty of whatever crime they wanted, even though there were no corroborating witnesses. This was a very important part of the Jewish law. the first society that introduced the idea that you must have corroborating eyewitnesses, otherwise you cannot convict somebody of crime. So they met at night. That was rule number one they broke. No witnesses who could agree with each other. That was rule number two that they broke. The basic demand that they placed before Jesus is to get him to admit that he was the Messiah, the Son of God. See, because this was a religious trial, and the people running the show now are the priests. The Pharisees have been hounding Jesus for 3 years, but their contestations with Jesus were largely theological ones. For the priests, for the Sadducees, and all this happened or was triggered by that triumphal entry, this was more serious because it was political. And it could mean their loss of control. If they lose control, Caesar would remove the high priest and they would lose their privileges. And so for them, Jesus was not so much a religious thing, it was a political thing. Even the challenge of him being a Messiah was a political statement, because if a Messiah did really come, then the high priests and the chief priests and all those high ranking temple people, they would lose their status as well, because they knew the scriptures. So one of the things the Messiah did or Messiah would do is to change the whole worship system. You can read this in the prophecies of Isaiah and so on. And so, being the Sanhedrin, they had to pretend it was religious, but really it was very much a political thing. Now, there were two responses on the part of Jesus. At first, he just kept quiet. He wouldn't talk, wouldn't say anything. But as they pushed the issue, he then made a claim. And the claim really irked them, it irritated them, because he says, "You will see the Son of Man." And they knew this from Old Testament texts, that the phrase Son of Man was a messianic phrase. You know, Christians who never read the Old Testament or who have no understanding of the Old Testament do not realize that the phrase Son of Man was understood to be a messianic phrase by the Jews at the time of Jesus. And so when he says, "You will see the Son of Man," he's saying that he is the Messiah. And then he claims that he will be seated with God on his throne, and that you will see God coming, which Judaism teaches that really no one can see, because isn't that what God said to Moses on Mount Sinai? Well, that is true. But they forgot that Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Micah, Zechariah, they speak about a paradigm shift, a transformation of human existence, of the Jewish people of Israel, when the Messiah comes. He doesn't just come to liberate them from the Romans, he comes to actually change the paradigm of existence, to correct everything that they were not able to correct those some 1,000 years of history before Jesus actually appeared, or even more than that. And so they understood immediately that he was claiming to be the Messiah. Of the four Gospels, the one who used this designation most frequently was Mark. Okay. And so if you go back and then read apocryphal writings, between Malachi and Matthew, this was an understood term. The Essenes who lived in Qumran community, they understood this and wrote treatises about it, that this would be one of the primary designations of the Messiah, the Son of Man. Jesus is not identifying himself with the human race when he did this. He's not saying that he is human like everybody else. Jesus never ever made that claim. But when he used the term Son of Man, they did not understand it as being Jesus saying, "I'm human like you." They clearly understood him as being Messiah. Now, they also knew that the Messiah who will come will also be a ruler. It's all over the Old Testament prophecies. The one thing these priests knew, and also the Pharisees who were in the Sanhedrin, they all knew their scriptures inside out. And this is why the rejection of the Sanhedrin is so difficult for the Christian church to deal with. Now, you know that Christianity eventually would start this idea that the Jews rejected Jesus. This is never the case. The Jews, as a people, as a faith, did not reject Jesus. The Sanhedrin rejected Jesus. And even with the Sanhedrin, we know of at least two men, and probably three, who were uh, against this, who did not go along, and who may not have even been invited to this meeting. We know Nicodemus was not anti-Christ, anti-Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea was not anti-Jesus, and there may have been others. So the picture we get when you put all the four gospels together is it was not a full Sanhedrin that got together that night. Now, the Sanhedrin believes itself to be the inheritors of the first council established around Mount Sinai by Moses, the 70 elders that would be invited to have dinner with God on Mount Sinai. And they could actually trace their lineage back to that council. You had to be 30 years old and you had to be married to be a Sanhedrin member. This is how we know Paul was married at some point, because he was a member of the Sanhedrin when we first meet him in Acts. And so was Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, and maybe some others that were involved with Jesus. There were Pharisees who were very sympathetic towards Jesus. Interestingly, in the book of Acts, we learn that there were priests who were also sympathetic, but those normal priests were not involved in the Sanhedrin. The only priestly group were the high priest and the chief priest. We don't even know how many of them were there. What we do know is that roughly 2/3 of the Sanhedrin was made up of these priests. They came under the party name of Sadducees. They were actually all priests. So when you think Sadducees, think priests. Now, here's the interesting thing. They led the worship of the temple, but they were far more secularized than the Pharisees. Pharisees controlled the synagogues, but they were extremely conservative. People did not like the Pharisees because they lived opulent lifestyles. People admired the Pharisees. And it's amazing that most of the debates and arguments Jesus had was with the Pharisees. But Pharisees did not drive the idea of getting rid of him, of killing him. That was the Sadducee thing, that was the priest thing. And, how he talked about the temple and about himself as Messiah, of course, would have really irked them. Now, the trial of the Sanhedrin in Matthew is relatively short. The verdict came very quickly, and that was death for blasphemy. Now, according to Jewish law at the time, somebody who was accused of blasphemy would be stoned to death. Now, you have to understand what stoning to death would have meant. They would pick up rocks and throw these rocks at the person until the person is completely buried under those rocks. You literally become entombed in the rocks. It was a very violent, very painful. It took a while before the victim would lose consciousness and die. And even then, they would keep stoning until the person is completely buried. The only modern example that is similar is some of the stoning episodes that we have seen in the news that happened in Afghanistan, Iraq, some of those extreme countries, okay, especially Afghanistan. And Pakistan also still does it, though technically in Pakistan it's supposed to be illegal by the secular constitution. However, the Sadducees ran into a legal problem because while they can convict somebody, they cannot execute the sentence. This was part of the control that Caesar placed upon the Sanhedrin. You can do your work, you can do whatever you like. They have basically autonomous power except for that one thing. Only the Romans can order the execution of a prisoner or a criminal. And so they had to take him to Pilate. And in Matthew, it goes quickly from that trial to Pilate. In between, Matthew pays attention to what happens to Peter and Judas. So let's talk about those two. Jesus had indicated that Judas will betray him and had predicted that Peter would deny him. Now we know that Peter had laid claim to this great vow that he will die for Jesus. And Christ had given him a sign that he will know when he had betrayed. What's interesting about the story is that it has this idea of three running through the narrative. So Peter was accused in three places. First, outside the courtyard. This is not the temple courtyard. This would be the courtyard of the high priest's house, because that's where the Sanhedrin was meeting. By the gate of that courtyard, and by the third one is by the gate. We're not sure if it was the same gate or another gate. It's not so clear from Matthew. There's a bit of ambiguity there. Peter would face three challenges. First, by one servant girl at the gate, then by a second servant girl, one servant girl at the courtyard, another servant girl at the gate, and then by bystanders. This would have been a bigger group. You see, when the Sanhedrin met, this became an occasion because of how important the Sanhedrin was to Jewish life. But there were also those soldiers and those ruffians that had been involved in the arrest of Jesus. So all these people were there. And they all accused Peter, of being a disciple of Jesus, mainly because of his Galilean accent. They knew that the disciples of Jesus were all Galileans. Of course, they didn't know that Judas Iscariot, who was Judean, was a disciple. But, they could hear him. So Peter must have gotten into conversations with these people around these spots. Otherwise, how would they figure out that he was? Or maybe they just look at him, he was the one who's the friend who's strange, and accuse him of being a follower of Jesus. And then we meet the three denials of Peter. They are in a crescending order. Because in the first denial, all that Peter said, I don't know what you're talking about. He didn't say, I don't know him. He just says, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm lost. What are you saying? The second one is much stronger. Crescendo rises. He says, I don't know him. And then he makes an oath, basically making a vow about not knowing him. It's like saying, I swear, I really swear I don't know him. The third time gets really, really strong, where he says, I don't know him, and accompanied by a bunch of profanity. Now, Matthew does not record the profanity words that he would have used, but we do know a little bit about the culture of the Galilean fishermen. They were relatively unpolished people. That's why in Judea, they look at the Galileans as being the hillbillies of Palestine. They were pretty vulgar. They were street people. And if you walk the streets of the world today, you hear street people in those more manual type professions tend to have very unrefined speech. And as a seasoned fisherman, Peter probably knew all the colorful swear words. And so he, in his attempt to prove that he was not a disciple of Jesus, it was not enough to take an oath, to swear, I don't know him. But now he's hoping, I'm guessing, that they would realize that somebody who was a disciple of Jesus would probably not bring out all this vulgar language coming out of his mouth. And then, of course, we know the rest of the story. The rooster crows. Peter, in Matthew, Peter does not actually see Jesus. In other Gospels, I think Luke and John maybe, there's actually some kind of eye contact as they drag Jesus out of the Sanhedrin towards Pilate's. In Matthew, it seems more like Peter seeing Jesus in his mind's eye because he remembers the words. What Matthew does remember, and we don't know why, maybe he was close by to Peter at the time, the response of Peter that Peter ran away from this place and he went out and he wept bitterly. Matthew seems to imply this was the turning point in Peter's life. This proud, braggart, easy speaking, never really thinking disciple would become a great leader of the church. He would sacrifice his life for Jesus. And according to church tradition, Peter was arrested in Rome and requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to be crucified even the same way that Jesus was. And Matthew kind of leaves Peter there. In John, Jesus would have a special encounter with Peter after the resurrection, but we don't know that in so much in Matthew. Actually, the synoptics don't speak about that story at all. It's unique to John. The other bad fish was, of course, Judas Iscariot. Now, notice by the narrative spacing that Matthew gives to Judas, he kept tabs of what really happened. So we get the idea that Matthew didn't really run very far away. He was keeping an eye and gathering information from a distance, safe distance. We are told that Judas became very remorseful. So remorseful that he went and returned the money. Well, he threw it back at the priest and plus made a confession that I have sinned, he said. I have sinned because I have betrayed. But unlike Peter, who was also remorseful and had a turnaround, Judas did not see the possibility of turning around. Now, when he returned the money and made this confession that he had sinned, the priests who were there and were the receiving end of Judas throwing these coins back at them, they basically said to him, and I'm paraphrasing here, hey, it's your problem. Nothing to do with us. We paid you. We got our men. They were very callous. When you read Matthew's account of these priests, they were very callous men, at least in this particular episode. No idea of mercy, no empathy, nothing. And the number 3 repeats itself. There were 3 reactions. Judas went out and hanged himself. Now, this is very interesting because Deuteronomy, which means the Torah, had clearly said that anybody who was hung from a tree would be cursed for eternity by God. In other words, to use Torah language, if you are hung from a tree, you could not be redeemed. And so you have a double whammy, because in Leviticus, taking one's life is also an unpardonable sin. So being hung from a tree or hanging himself from a tree, taking his own life, Judas, being relatively well educated and probably well versed in the Torah, knew that this was it. There would be no more hope. He had committed level 4 of sin from the Old Testament. The Old Testament teaches 4 levels of sin. This is level 4. In the book of Numbers, it's called Yadrom, which means the high hand. It's also called blasphemy against God. Jesus calls it the unpardonable sin. Something that you do where there is no sacrifice available, there is no grace available, and redemption will not happen. And so Judas had clearly crossed that line. Now, here's the interesting thing about the Old Testament concept of sin. You can descend all the way down to level 3 and still find salvation. But if you cross into level 4, you cannot find salvation. And it's very difficult to understand what Jesus meant, and this is quoted by Matthew, about the unpardonable sin. Okay, unless you understand first what happens in the Torah about sin. Christians tend to have this idea that sin is sin, but the Bible doesn't know such a thing. Sin is not always sin. It is not only measured by the act itself, but also by the motives behind the act, but also by the status of the person. Many of us don't realize that in the Torah, if a priest committed a sin that is identical to an ordinary Israelite, they cannot pay the same sacrifice. The priest had to bring a much bigger sacrifice in order to be forgiven. So there was disparity about the seriousness of sin depending on your status. The more blessed you are, the more responsibility you hold in the kingdom of God, the weightier the level of sin, and therefore the sacrifice required for it. You know, for the most common sin in Israel, the level one, an ordinary Israelite could make do, if he was really poor, with just 2 handfuls of flour. He could not afford pigeons, he could not afford lambs, he could not afford goats, he could not afford cattle for sure. But if a high priest committed the exact same sin, he had to bring a bull. That was the most expensive offering ever. Now, at the second level of sin, the sacrifice is pretty steep and it applies to everybody. And so we believe that Israel didn't commit that sin too often. At the third level, there is no sacrifice prescribed, but forgiveness is still possible. A grace is still at play. So Judas is in level 4. If people ask, will Judas be in heaven? No way, because he has crossed that barrier into level 4 and nobody can be redeemed. The Hebrew word for that level is cherem. Anybody who reaches cherem can never come back up. That's the closest to an idea of some total disconnection from God or the Christian hell concept that you will find in the Hebrew Bible. Now, the priests didn't know what to do with the money. They gave it a designation. They called it blood money because they knew what the money had done. It had brought Jesus to them, and Jesus' blood was about to be shed. And maybe they also saw that this guy is about to hang himself, so his blood as well. So what they did instead, and this is validated according to Matthew by a prophecy in Zechariah, that they bought a field that can be used as a cemetery for foreigners. Now that's interesting. You have to remember that in the covenant of Sinai, foreigners were not given part of the covenant. There were two groups of people, foreigners and eunuchs could not be part of the covenant. And Isaiah tells us that when the new covenant is established, God would remove those barriers. And so when the New Testament speaks about the new covenant, that's really what's happening. It's a big paradigm shift. This also tells us that foreigners largely didn't have a special place for them to be buried. And so they bought this field so that they can bury foreigners who die in Judea at the time. And of course, they gave it an appropriate name, Field of Blood. Archaeologically, we don't know where this may have been. We can only guess that it would not have been anywhere near the temple or the high priest's house because of the contamination effect. But here is the irony. They were ready to kill Jesus for some trumped up charge of blasphemy. And yet, at this point in the story, they seem to express some kind of empathy for foreigners who might die but have no access to covenant rights. And so let's buy a field for them, you know, and we can bury them there. My feeling is that Roman soldiers who died on duty may have also been buried there, or any strangers that were passing through. And so that's what happened. Different reaction from Judas, different reaction from the priests. First, what they did with the money, and secondly, what they thought this money could help somebody. Think of it like taking somebody's sacrifice and then using it as a charity thing. And this was a strange night in the life of the Sadducees. They were priests. Now, the interesting thing is that they probably did not touch that money because it would have contaminated them. But we know that they had assistants. They had so-called servants, but not really servants in the modern sense. They were assistants. because the rules for the holiness of a priest and the contamination possibilities on a priest were so tight and so many that most priests had personal assistants who ensured that they don't get contaminated by things around them. So hopefully that helps clear up how they would have touched that money when actually it would have contaminated them. Uh, you see something like that these days in Thailand when the monks come around to collect their offerings from people in the villages, in the homes. They actually have an assistant who follows them around with a cart, and he would be the one who will take that food and load it onto that cart. The monk himself doesn't really do much work anymore, just recites a little prayer for the devotees, and that's it. And so the next trial, only two trials in Matthew. The second trial is Pilate. Now they had come to the conclusion and had put out the verdict that Jesus should be executed, but no authority to execute the death sentence. And so they had to bring to Pilate, and hopefully they can wrestle enough um, leverage on Pilate to get him to make the decision, which they tried. Now, when Jesus met Pilate, it descended initially into a Q&A session. Pilate had questions, hoping that Jesus would respond. The first question was, "Are you really the king of the Jews?" And Jesus did respond. His answer is, "Well, that's what you say." Now, clearly, Pilate did not see this as a challenge on the part of Jesus. He did not even see it as Jesus saying, "Yes, I'm the king." It's like Jesus saying, "That's what you're saying." That's what everybody seems to be saying. So Pilate was not offended. The greatest offense in the Roman Empire is to claim royalty. Okay. The second question was rather interesting. He says, "Don't you hear all the charges these people are bringing against you? Don't you want to say something to defend yourself?" He's giving, because Roman law required, he's giving time for Jesus to defend himself, since Jesus had no lawyer to argue his case. Now, Pilate was quite surprised that Jesus did not do this. Now, Jesus is not unique in the Bible. When Moses was attacked by his own siblings and his own tribes people in the desert, he did exactly the same thing. He kept quiet. They were ready to overthrow Moses. Imagine his own brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam. Moses did not defend himself. And Jesus followed that example as well. When that would not elicit any response from Jesus, he then turns to the crowd, and Matthew gives us the detail that at Passover, this is Passover time, it was a practice of the Romans to show some mercy that they would release a prisoner. And Pilate thought, well, maybe if I use this practice, people will wake up and see the nonsense that they've been doing, and maybe they'll wake up. Now, he chose a particular prisoner, Barabbas. Comparing what the Gospels say about Barabbas and understanding what we understand about the different groups in Israel, or in particularly in the Roman provinces of Judea and Samaria and Galilee, Barabbas would not have been an ordinary criminal. He would not have been a thief, nor the people who would be crucified with Jesus. Barabbas would have been Osama bin Laden. He was probably a leader, a battalion leader of the Zealots. Now, the Zealots were a violent, patriotic religious organization whose one mission was to overthrow the Romans. And their primary methods was assassination. They would assassinate any Roman who they could lay their hands on, and anybody who collaborated with the Romans, like tax collectors. They were violent people. But within the Zealots, there was an ultra right, ultra violent segment called the Sicarii. And, personally, and other scholars also believe that Barabbas was a Sicarii. and they would be the most wanted criminal of the Roman government, the Roman. And so Pilate probably was thinking, if I offer them the worst criminal I have in my jail, maybe the people will wake up. So he says, okay, I'm ready to release somebody. Would you like me to release Jesus or Barabbas? And we get the impression from the way Matthew writes that when the people chose Barabbas, that Pilate was a little bit shocked. Really? What's wrong with these people? They want Barabbas. Pilate is not ready to give up because in his heart of hearts, he couldn't really find a reason to even arrest Jesus. So he asked the crowd, and I'm sure that the Sadducees were egging on the crowd, then what should I do with Jesus, the Messiah? And at this point, Pilate seems to indicate that he understood the Messiah or he was being very sarcastic. And so the cry came, crucify him. We want him crucified. And Pilate is still not convinced. He says, why? What crime has he committed? But instead of explaining their case, even the Sadducees didn't bother. They just simply cried. They just became a mob at this point. Crucify him, crucify him. Just like those mobs that we've been seeing on television with some of those universities in Sydney, in Melbourne, in London, in Washington, D.C., in Los Angeles. Mindless mobs. Crucify him, crucify him. And so we need to explore a little bit this very unusual relationship between Pilate and Jesus. We can clearly see that Pilate is surprised that they chose Barabbas, that they chose crucifixion of Jesus, even though there was no real reason, no real justice behind it. He knew, and Matthew records the thoughts of Pilate, that he knew when they cried, crucify him, and that it was these religious leaders who led that battle cry, that they were doing it out of envy. This was Pilate's take on the whole thing, that they were simply jealous of Jesus. Now that's amazing that he was willing to go the next step, even after basically deciding in his mind that, no crime has been committed here. This is just a bunch of uh, religious leaders who were envious of a possible new religious leader on the scene. To compound the discomfort of Pilate, his wife sends a message, please leave this man alone, and tells him that she has had horrible dreams during the night because of this man who is completely innocent. And Pilate didn't contradict his wife because he also believed Jesus was innocent. And he literally states, what has he done? He hasn't done anything. I find no crime that he has committed. But then when the crowd pushes, in Matthew, we don't know about what we would read in the other Gospels, the blackmail that they would use on his relationship with Caesar. Now, here's the thing we need to understand though. Matthew doesn't tell us that, but Luke would. Um, Judea was considered the most ungovernable province in the Roman Empire. And any procurator, that's the Roman term for governor, any governor who was assigned to Judea saw it as political banishment or political punishment or some kind of an exile. And so these guys who were sent to Judea, they worked very hard to please the Jews, hoping that the Jews, especially the Jewish leaders, naming the priests, that they would, put in a good word with Caesar on their behalf. When you read the book of Acts, you discover that the Roman governors of Judea did not last long. Pilate lasted a few years. Most of them would stay for 2 years or whatever and then run off. Okay, they try to get a reappointment somewhere else. This was seen as the province where you don't want to go. You don't want to be governor in Judea. It's too much headache, too much problem. For all the might of the Roman Empire, it would take them 3 years of war to put down the rebellion in Judea. So you can imagine. And during Jesus's lifetime, Judea and Galilee, that's where most of the Jews lived. So the Romans saw those as a combined entity. It was always on fire, always fomenting uh, rebellion. And many of the rebellion leaders actually came from Galilee. And now Jesus was from Galilee too. Despite all that history, Pilate did not find fault with Jesus. Now, we also know from Roman historical records that Pilate was not exactly an upright governor. He was literally sent there to this difficult province as a kind of punishment so that he would straighten his ways. And not long after the crucifixion of Jesus, Pilate was moved, he was transferred. A clear sign by Roman law that they did not agree, the emperor did not agree that this had been a just killing, a just execution. So Pilate was removed and he was sent off to some even more remote province in the Roman Empire and then disappears basically from history. Okay, so the steps to the cross. What really actually happened to Jesus? The first step was the flogging. See, the Romans don't just take a person and crucify them right away, they have to flog. Now, you see the picture there at the top of a Roman flog. Um, this was a very cruel form of punishment. The whip had these like strings, or rather ropes attached to it. And these ropes were studded with lead pieces, not finely like in this picture. These lead pieces would be very crude, very rough. And the way they would exercise this, they would tie a prisoner up to a stake, and then like in the below picture, the straight one, and then they would hit the prisoner with that whip, but not lift the whip up. They would hit the prisoner and allow the whip to wrap itself around the prisoner and then drag the whip up, tearing the flesh as they went. They would do that both with the front and the back. A crucified prisoner like Jesus, who was flogged first, by the time he reached the cross step, he literally had no more skin on his body. It was all open. That's why even Mel Gibson didn't dare to depict that, in at least not fully, in the Passion of the Christ film. It was a horrible thing. And they did this just long enough that the person does not lose consciousness. Can you imagine watching and feeling the pain as this whip tears your skin, literally? Often you can see pieces of your skin attached to those lead pieces, the front and the back. Then, when they were satisfied, the next step. Now, this didn't usually happen, but I guess the soldiers wanted a little bit of fun and games. Uh, the mocking. Now, most of us are very interested in the crown of thorns that they put on Jesus. I used to think that it was largely the acacia tree. We know the acacia has thorns, and they're fairly long thorns, that they made a crown out of this and stuck it on his head. But on a trip to Israel, I discovered, and the guide kind of affirmed this possibility, that there was another plant, also from the acacia family, that was the more likely culprit of that crown of thorns. Because the normal acacia plant has straight thorns, okay? And so, yes, you make into a crown and you stick into the head. Eventually, they remove the crown so they can just toss it out. But to add to the suffering of this prisoner, they probably used the other plant, the other acacia variety, which had crook horns. And when you press that into a person's skull and then you pull it out, it would tear the skull, from all over. My cap on that trip actually got caught on one of those plants, and it took a lot of effort. First, my cap went off to the tree, and then trying to pull it out of the tree got some cuts. Okay, the things like a hook, it just pulls at your skin. And I think that's what they would have used on the crown of Jesus, on the head of Jesus. The suffering of Christ, the physical suffering, is much worse than we ever could imagine. And then comes the crucifixion itself. And here is where we meet some details from Matthew. There was a stranger by the name of Simon who was from Cyrene, this is in North Africa, who had come a long ways to celebrate Passover, and he ends up helping Jesus carry the cross. The place where the crucifixion took place was Golgotha. This is Golgotha. I've been twice to this place, and there's a road running below here. And this road was in existence at the time. Now, when I was a kid, they used to tell us that Jesus was crucified on Calvary. And so he was crucified on a hilltop. Now, this is Calvary, the Greek name for it. Golgotha is the Aramaic name. Now, the Romans would not crucify somebody on a hilltop. Okay. Crucifixion had two primary objectives. One is the most severe punishment for the worst kind of crimes. The second is deterrence. And so what they did when they crucified people is they would crucify them by the roadside. So the cross of Jesus and those two men crucified with him would have been down here. The skull. This hill really looks like a skull. You can see the eye sockets. You can see the nose socket and so on. So the crucifixion would have taken here on the street level. It would not have happened up there on the hill. So all this Christian art that you've ever seen, they are wrong. Now, why would they crucify on the roadside? Because people who pass by would then see, and they would be frightened. They wouldn't repeat that. Something else that we don't see in any of the film, because they would never have made a film that way. A prisoner who was crucified naked, no clothes on. Now think about Jesus. His scalp was torn to shreds by that crowd. Press it in, then pull it out. His body, his skin was all gone. They stripped him of his clothes before they nailed him on the cross. The whole point was to shame the prisoner and his family, his relatives, his friend as much as you can. Now, we are told that two people were crucified beside Jesus. The old Bible translations call them thief. No, they would have been zealots or sicarii. No common thief would be crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for the worst criminals or people who fought against the Romans, like the zealots and people who claimed to be Messiah. In other words, political prisoners. And the zealots or sicarii, these two men would have been sicarii. They were the worst of the worst. They were political as well as religious fighters, revolutionaries. Now, Matthew doesn't record conversation between Jesus and them. What he does record is the scoffing that took place. It says that the people passing by, you see, if the crucifixion took place at the hilltop here, there is no road up here, nobody would be passing by. So these details, Matthew is very clear about the details. But the crucifixion down here, everybody would have seen it. So a lot of people passing by, that they scoffed at Jesus. And the scoffing seems to take one particular thing. Oh, he did so much to perform miracles. Let's see if he can perform one for himself. The religious leaders, they didn't run away like the disciples. They were right there observing the whole thing, and they scoffed Jesus as well. And Matthew says, unlike Luke, that these two criminals also scoffed Jesus as well. And so again, you have this threefold thing that is happening everywhere. So he's scoffed by three different groups of people. Now, a little bit of mystery about what kind of cross did the Romans use. Well, the Romans had several different kinds of cross. There was a one-stake cross. This usually would be a sharpened pole, and they would hang a person on this pole by inserting the pole through his anal entry all the way up to his neck, come out, and then the person would be hanging there to die. The more common one was this, a T-shaped cross. Okay, so those two Sicarii people crucified with Jesus would have been crucified this way. This was a special cross used are reserved for the most special prisoners, the high value prisoners, the high profile prisoners. And we know Jesus was crucified on a cross that looks like this. So all the Christian art got this thing correct because they needed this head piece on the top so they can put a sign about such a prisoner. And all the Gospels tell us that they put a sign about Jesus. So does Matthew, um, King of the Jews, or he claimed to be King of the Jews. Okay. They also had some very crude crosses when they were in a hurry. Basically, just take a tree and trim off some branches that spread and hang a person up there. Now, Roman crosses, unlike what you see in Christian art, even these, they were very rough pieces of wood that were simply spliced together and tied up with ropes because they want to reuse them again and again. They were not those fashionable things that you see on Christian art, nicely cut wood and so on. No, they just chop some log. These would probably just be pieces of a tree, whatever was available. Now, here is how the crucifixion would take place, especially with this kind of cross, because it would be taller. A cross like this was usually just a bit taller than normal human height. But special prisoners required a special cross, it had to be more visible, so the cross would be longer. What they would do is dig a pit where the cross would eventually stand, lay the cross down, nail the prisoner. These prisoners were not nailed, they were just bound with ropes on the T shape. The special ones would be nailed and also bound with ropes, and even their feet or their ankles would be nailed together. Now, in all Christian art, you see the nailing on the hands. That's not possible because it needed to support the body, and the nails or the spikes were too large. So we know that the nailing would have happened here, so the body could hang. They also tied. But the ankles was worse. They would put the ankles together like this, twist them to the side, and then nail through both ankles into the wood. And then lift the cross up and literally drop it into that pit, fill it up, and let it stand there for the hours until the prisoner died. Okay. What I want you to imagine is the physical pain. We're not dealing with the psychological pain or the spiritual pain that Jesus was carrying, but the sheer physical pain that he went through, the flogging, the kind of cross, and the manner in which that cross would be put in its place. Of course, Jesus didn't live long on the cross. Now, here is a mystery of the crucifixion of Christ. An average prisoner would last at least 3 days on that cross. The really strong prisoners would even last up to 7 days on that cross. Now, the Romans developed an idea of mercy. And so, if a prisoner by the third day is not dead, they would break the knees, because what the prisoner would do is they try to lift themselves up using their legs to push them up so they can breathe. So, literally, a crucified prisoner did not die because of crucifixion, but rather asphyxia. You reach a point, once they break the knees, your body sags down, your lungs collapse, you cannot breathe anymore, and then you die. Then they can take you off. Now, all the Gospels highlight the surprise that the soldiers had that Jesus died within 6 hours. Nobody dies that quickly. So we know there were other causes or stressors that caused his death. The physical pain was horrible. The Romans specialized crucifixion, and military historians say that this is the most horrible form of execution that humans have ever invented. Now, many of the northern European tribes would adopt this crucifixion thing from the Romans and use it. That's why so many disciples of Jesus ended up on crosses, okay, because of that mentality. In the East here, even in the most violent periods of the shogun in Japan or the Meiji Revolution in China or anywhere, we never really read about crosses. Okay, this seems to be a very Western thing. Now, crosses were actually used before the Romans, but the Romans specialized on this. So everything from the nature of the cross of Jesus to the sign that was put over his head to the manner of both nailing and strapping him down with ropes, Jesus was being crucified like he was the worst of the worst. Think of all the irony here. The priests wanted him out of the way by whatever means. Pilate knew he didn't deserve any of it, but capitulated anyway to the pressure from the priests. The people who witnessed it, they simply saw a man who could have saved himself but doesn't save himself and found that funny. And then the physical pain that accompanied Jesus through the flogging, through the trials, and then the nature of the crucifixion itself. Now, we're not done with the passion narratives, but we can't possibly finish them tonight. And so we will continue next week and look at the rest of the passion narratives, his burial, his resurrection, and some of the details that Matthew provides about that aspect of his life. All right, so let me first